Cornel, even if he is polling at a fairly marginal level, that's a serious threat to Joe Biden. His commitment to the working class is real. I don't think any of that's fake, but Bernie is the careerist. Cornel has a depth that is so far beyond Kennedy. I mean, these people are part of the problem. AFL-CIO, all these people. One of my major concerns about the People's Party is it not only didn't have any ballot access, it really didn't have any structure. And this whole gig economy is just a species of serfdom, really. And it's not going to get better. My best educated guess is that, yes, he's authentic. He does not, however, have the long track record of standing with the marginalized and being an anti-imperialist the way Cornel does. Watch how they pile on Cornel. And they pile on Cornel because they're frightened. And it's our job to make sure not only they are frightened, but they're even more frightened.
It's my pleasure to welcome back to Bad Faith Podcast, Chris Hedges, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, author, and one of the truest voices, most widely respected on the left today. Welcome back, Chris.
Thanks, Brianna.
Now, you and I made a little news last week.
No, you made news. You were the journalist. You asked the right question at the right time. I've been there. Don't blame it on me.
Well, I will say, I mean, it was softly suggested to me that I not make the whole worker strike back New York launch a referendum on Cornel West having just thrown his hat into the 2024 presidential race. But I could not help myself at the very end. I thought I exercised great restraint waiting to the very end of the panel to simply ask you what you thought of the choice of him announcing as MPP. And of course, that night, perhaps a little naively thinking that people weren't recording it and blasting it to the internet. We're very honest about the fact that you were arranging a meeting the next morning between him and the Green Party. And of course, we all know the news now that he is planning to run with the Green Party in addition to MPP. Is that right?
He's primarily a Green candidate. Let's put it that way. Yeah,
okay.
I mean, there can be other parties that are part of the coalition, but all of the organizing and all of the infrastructure will be Green.
Okay. So speak to me about infrastructure. You know, strategically, what are we looking at in terms of ballot access? Where should people be looking to help to the extent that they want to make sure that they have the best chance of being able to vote for Cornel West in the general election in every state? What's the trajectory looking like?
Well, it's rough because, I worked with Ralph Nader and I didn't do ballot access for him, but I watched. And Ralph himself, of course, is a lawyer, brilliant lawyer. And every state is different and the hurdles are tremendous. I mean, really, almost insurmountable. The Greens have about 20 states. I think, remember, we're a year and a half out. So I don't think it's unrealistic to think that they could get another 20. I think when Jill ran, she had 44 states. Mm-hmm. And then there are states where you can write in as an independent. But it's really hard. And that was really one of my major concerns about the People's Party is it not only didn't have any ballot access, it really didn't have any structure. And the Democrats are going to be, they were vicious towards Ralph. They will sue you in court. They will create legal teams to challenge your ballot access. So the legal fees were tremendous. I think over $1 million. And it wasn't that anything was wrong with the petitions, but the Democrats will just challenge every name. They did that to Matt Howe when he ran for Senate. So it's a tough battle, and you really need people who are experienced in dealing with that. And that wasn't going to happen unless he moved to the Green. Now, the Green, I've had a long relationship with the Greens. It can be pretty dysfunctional as well. It's got to really open its doors to a whole new generation of activists. Whether they do that or not, I don't know, because some of these Green parties are just a collection of like old cranks who want to, put their name on the ballot to be governor or something. No, I'm not, I've been there. And so the Green Party has...
as a candidate?
What?
You mean as a candidate yourself?
I was a candidate for 24 hours until our head of RT in a panic called and said, under FCC rules, we got to cancel your show. Mm-hmm. The only reason I agreed is because normally the Greens run someone in my district. They didn't have anyone. So I wasn't going to go mount a serious campaign. but I wasn't about to sacrifice, unless I was going to mount a serious campaign. It made no sense to sacrifice my show, which on RT had huge reach, not just nationally, but internationally.
Yeah, for sure. So do you think that this moment of Cornel West running as a Green, finally getting someone who already has a lot of cultural traction, name recognition, all of those kinds of things, is the moment that some have been waiting for, where the Green Party has an opportunity to claim more authenticity, more legitimacy than it has done in the past, and perhaps reform itself from something of an anachronism, a party filled with kind of, for lack of a better stereotype, old hippies from a previous generation, and to get infused with some of the younger Bernie-esque, whatever you want to call it, more recent revolutionary energy? Is now the moment?
It is the moment. Whether they'll do it or not, I don't know, because unfortunately I built my career out of two dying institutions, the church and newspapers. And what happens is when those institutions feel threatened is they fold in on themselves. They become completely self-referential. And I just am not that connected to the Green Party infrastructure. I've had tangential, I've spoken at conventions and stuff. But I do think they have to do some serious restructuring, and they have to step aside to bring in young activists, former Bernie activists, whatever, because that's really where the energy is going to be. And it's also where, in terms of you'll need a lot of volunteers.
What does it mean to step aside? I mean, structurally, what's going on in the organization is not the case that interested parties shouldn't reach out to their local Green Party and, run for various positions or sign up to volunteer. I mean, is it really the case that there are people occupying space and kind of holding on, white knuckling it, that need to be ousted by?
Okay, I can't.
What does it mean? Yeah,
I can't answer that because I'm not really that, but that's what I fear. And if this is going to be a viable candidacy, it's got to be a big tent. It's got to be inclusive. You can't ask people to come into an organization and immediately be subject to a hierarchy. There's got to be a kind of collaboration, especially if you're going to bring in young volunteers. So you were involved in the Bernie campaign, so you know all that. But that is, and I'm speaking theoretically. So the Green Party may turn out to be fine, but I do think it's something we want to keep an eye on.
I've heard you've been asked in an interview if you were going to be part of Cornel West's campaign, and you said something along the lines of, "I'm trying not to be, but you're getting sucked in." What's the status of that now?
Well, I mean, Cornel's a very close friend of mine over many, many years, so I'm definitely sucked in. I mean, especially in terms of like handling media, and not just handling media, but perhaps messaging and stuff like that. I don't have time to do that full time. And right now, Cornel's just trying to build an infrastructure, which I'm helping with. And Jill Stein is an acting campaign manager. And she, of course, has, and Ajamu was great, Ajamu Baraka. So they have really the experience that Cornel needs. But, we have to build. I mean, I will obviously help Cornel, give him as much help as he thinks he needs. And right now, it's, there is, we have to create a campaign, and you have to pull in people who you trust. I mean, there's no question. I used to tell this to the kids in Zuccotti. I mean, the state, the internal organs of the state have massive resources, and they're not going to, especially allow Cornel, even if he is polling at a fairly marginal level. That's a serious threat to Joe Biden because of how close, at least according to polls, the race will be between, I assume, Trump and Biden. I mean, Biden is just a phenomenally weak candidate, and it says a lot about the Democratic Party. That's who they're coughing up, like Kamala Harris is,
Absolutely. I will say I was in a social situation with friends over the weekend who were much more open to the Democratic Party, shall I say, than I am. People who, tend toward being a little more credulous about the Democratic Party's failures and place more blame on Republicans and obstructionists like Manchin and Sinema than a lot of the left does. And even they were kind of not in a position to defend Joe Biden. The feeling, even among more mainstream Democrats, really does seem to be what polls have been telling us for a long time, which is the overwhelming majority of Americans, including a majority of Democrats, simply do not want him to run again and are very concerned about what this race might look like. I'm sure you've heard the news, or the speculation rather, that the Democrats are positioning Gavin Newsom to kind of take the mantle if it seems to be the case that Joe Biden really starts to falter and flail. I don't know. Have you caught any of his recent media appearances, and what do you make of that strategically?
Well, he's kind of checked out. I mean, we just had too many examples of that, reading the prompts on his teleprompter, turn right, as if, and of course the latest, God Save the Queen. But he's...
Right.
All right. God save the Queen, man.
And the fact that they won't allow him to debate, I mean, that says a lot.
It does.
So
even John Fetterman debated, weeks after his stroke.
Yeah. So it's not an age issue. I think Bernie's older. Isn't he older than Biden?
Yes, he is.
So it's not an age issue. Ralph Nader's 89. I wouldn't want to debate Ralph if I was anyone having to go on stage. Ralph would slaughter you, which is why they never debated Ralph. So it's not an age issue, but he's not there. I mean, he's clearly not there. That doesn't matter. Reagan wasn't there at the end either. And they'll just, the empire can be managed as long as they can get him out there and he looks sentient and he can manage to walk himself to the podium and he can still read what they put in front of him. But I don't think that I think a lot of it's on, he's kind of running on autopilot. So, I mean, that's really dangerous because if Trump comes back, it's going to be a different administration. It's going to be one whose primary focus is vengeance. It's going to be very ugly. It was ugly before, but it's going to be nothing like it is now.
Vengeance on who exactly, you think?
First, it'll be the mainstream organs that Trump felt correctly went after him. So it'll be the media, it'll be the Democratic Party hierarchy. They'll be number one on the list. Critics like me who are critical of the entire system are not at the top of the list, but we also don't have that kind of reach. But it'll be against, and it'll be dismantling those mechanisms within the government, dismantling those institutions so that they become personally loyal to Trump. And he was starting to do that at the end of his presidency. So, I mean, we are entering a very dangerous time, which is why coughing up a figure like Biden is so foolish. And it reminds me very much of the end of Weimar, where the aristocrats who were all hated kept thinking they could contain the fascists and put forth one weak candidate, Bruning and all the others after another. I mean, remember, it's true that nobody wants him to run, but nobody wanted him to run in the first place. He couldn't, he had no traction in the primaries. And it was only until the Democratic Party hierarchy, including Obama, pressured other candidates to get out. And then, of course, all the dirty machinations that they carried out against Bernie. And that's, of course, what they'll do to Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy is no Cornel West. And my suspicion is that Bobby, especially with his long roots in the Democratic Party or his family's roots in the Democratic Party, is not going to be a rogue candidate. He's not going to, I'm guessing. I asked Dennis Kucinich, his campaign manager, whether he would honor the loyalty oath, and it's probably telling that Dennis didn't answer. So
by the loyalty oath, you mean the oath to say you're going to tell your supporters to vote for the eventual Democratic nominee.
Bernie running around trying to get people to vote for Clinton.
Yeah. I mean, what do you make of Bernie's choice to endorse Biden so early?
Well, Bernie, I have mixed feelings about Bernie. I think he's his commitment to the working class is real. I don't think any of that's fake. But Bernie is the careerist, and he is, and that goes all the way back to the Clintons. I mean, '96, he was campaigning for Bill Clinton after NAFTA.
Mm.
So he has decided to build this kind of Faustian relationship with the Democratic Party to protect himself. Okay, he gets what's the head of the banking committee. I guess that's what they gave him. I mean, It wouldn't be my dream in life. But if he, look, I know it's not even hypothetical because I was with Shama Sawant and Bernie and Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein. We were speaking together, all of us, the night before the climate march, and Shama kept pushing Bernie to run as an independent. And Bernie's final answer was, I don't want to be Nader. Which was really saying, I don't want them to destroy me. I don't want to become a pariah. And if he took on the Democratic Party, they would. So, and he knows that. So I think he has decided, I think he's wrong, but I think he has decided that it's better to accommodate himself to the system rather than not be within the system.
So just to put a pin on it, given everything that you've said about the vulnerabilities of Joe Biden and the kind of media frenzy, the obsequious praise of some of Gavin Newsom's recent media turns.
I don't think Joe Biden is mentally, physically capable of being the president of the United States. Hang on. I suspect if I took your phone and I took a look at it, not that I believe in privacy, I would never do that. I would bet on a daily basis that there are people urging you to run for president and primary him. Am I wrong in my assumption?
Well, my phone's been lighting up how well he did with the UK Prime Minister. My phone lit up and how he
that's a nice duck.
McCarthy on the debt ceiling.
Does your phone light up?
My phone lights up with Republican friends saying, you know what? Despite all of the rhetoric, these bipartisan bills he keeps passing on infrastructure and the CHIPS and Science Act, the bipartisan work he did on gun legislation reform and around the debt ceiling, make me feel maybe he's done a little bit better job than some are
suggesting. But that wasn't my question. Does your phone light up with, Gavin, you need to get in this primary? He's not able to run. He's not up to the job.
Look, everybody has their quiet chatter, and everybody's out there rooting for America. I'm rooting for our president. I have great confidence in his leadership.
Do you not think there's any chance the Democratic Party might choose to substitute out Gavin Newsom or somebody else for Biden if things start to look grim enough?
I'd have to guess. Having been a reporter for a really long time, I hate making those hypotheticals unless I've talked to people within positions of power who have the ability to make those kinds of choices, and I have not. So I can't answer.
But the evidence would be, or I guess the question is, do you think that Gavin Newsom, who I think objectively is putting himself out there in a way that feels distinct and purposeful and not just like he happens to have fallen into a news cycle because there's just news in California or something like that. He's getting these high profile sit downs with Sean Hannity. He's really front and center in a way that you might expect of someone who's positioning themselves, at least testing the waters for a presidential run. I mean, let me put it to you this way, so to get away from my hypotheticals. Do you think that would be a strategically beneficial choice from the perspective of the Democratic Party? And do you think they would be able to do that, sidestepping the awkwardness of Kamala Harris being right there as the VP?
I mean, in terms of optics, of course, it's better. But in terms of substance, i.e. those forces that are driving a disillusioned electorate, it doesn't make any difference.
Well, let's get back to... So go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah. So, I mean, what is it that I don't see them being able to pull votes from Trump? They're not addressing the fundamental issues that have pushed people into the arms of a demagogue. And then you have the huge apathy in the part of people who don't like either system. So that combination of anger, rage, white sense of dethronement, all of that stuff, deindustrialization. So you have a lot of people who are heavily motivated, coupled with a figure like Biden, coupled with apathy, coupled with a Democratic Party that sold you out and doesn't address your issues. That's a very dangerous combination. I don't know that Newsom is going to change that particularly.
Yeah.
But I mean, you are reaching a point where it's almost anything's better than Biden.
Right. Well, that brings us to the question of RFK Jr. Ajama Baraka was on the last episode of Bad Faith. He did not have a particularly sanguine view of the man or his ability to kind of follow through on some of his anti-war bona fides. I wonder what you make of RFK Jr., the authenticity of his run, and the way that his legacy as a Kennedy affects his politics going forward.
So I should preface this by saying that I'm very good friends with his campaign manager, Dennis Kucinich, who I like and have supported for a long time. I watched his announcement, and it was built on the superstructure of two lies. One, that America is a good people, that kind of deification of our virtue. And then the other was the deification of the Kennedys. That's another lie.
Wait a minute, Chris. Americans, I'm not saying Americans are better than anybody else, but you don't think it's kind of a position that most politicians, including Cornel West, kind of have to adopt? That
Cornel is not going to adopt that.
We're good and that we should rise to our greatest potential, even if we're flawed.
You can say that, but the deification of American history and the founding fathers,
sure, yes,
which is what he was doing.
Okay.
Cornel, sure. I'm going to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose you want to tell people they're good, having spent 20 years outside the empire in places like El Salvador in the Middle East. I can tell you there are a lot of Iraqis and Palestinians and Salvadorans who don't think we as a country are particularly good, given the plethora of crimes that we have committed against those Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth. Empire is a pretty evil entity. And of course, as James Baldwin pointed out, we choose not to look at empire, and we confuse, I'm quoting Baldwin, of course, we confuse ignorance with innocence. And then, as Baldwin said, that eventually turns you into a monster. So Cornel has a depth that is so far beyond Kennedy. I also have such a problem. I mean, there was one point in his announcement where Kennedy talked about his father coming back and saying that, the rich people have the bankers and this, but the workers or something have the Kennedys. I mean, coming out of the working class, that was a pretty nausea-inducing comment. Like, we need rich people like the Kennedys. I mean, the Kennedys, both Bobby and RFK, I mean, they would not have had a chance but for the fact that they came from a fabulously wealthy family, their father, Joe Kennedy, who bankrolled the campaign. So not only is that how JFK, and then all the dirty relationships with Daley and Chicago and everything else, but people forget that Bobby didn't run until Eugene McCarthy, the anti-war candidate, got a lot of traction. And Bobby was spending, it was his family money, $1 million a day, or I can't remember the figure, but he buried McCarthy, but it was very opportunistic. He also was as Attorney General, the person who put the wiretaps on Martin Luther King's, he hated King. He hated King. And if you read closely, neither of the Kennedys were particularly supportive of the civil rights movement, not in any real way.
That's going to seem so counterintuitive to the narrative that we're
well,
fed.
Of course, but that's how white people do it. They're good at it, George Washington, Lincoln freed the slaves. No, yeah. Lincoln wanted to ship enslaved people off to Madagascar. There's Frederick Douglass, who, was the abolitionist. William Lloyd Garrison, those figures. So we write, as Zinn says, we write those. We recreate the narrative. I mean, it's like FDR. No, FDR did not give us the New Deal. It were workers who were doing radical sit-down strikes in the auto plants. It was the old Communist Party. I mean, so there's always, and that's how you get tenured Princeton. You write big, thick books, like some of my colleagues, about Ronald Reagan or something. And Bobby speaks in that language. I mean, my big problem with him is over Palestine. I was 7 years in the Middle East. I I just won't support anyone who parrots the Israel line. I just can't. I mean, even if it's only me, I don't care. And his stuff on Israel is just awful. He also I mean, it's personal, but Roger Waters is a friend of mine, somebody I admire very much for both his artistic talent, but also his integrity and his courage, and he's trashing Roger. So those are maybe that's a little thing. I can't go there.
So what then do you make of so many people, and RFK Jr. himself has kind of framed the fact of his uncle and father being killed as you know, this is how he puts it, as they take this anti-establishment, anti-FBI, anti-war in Vietnam turn. And he has linked their murders to their substantive politics, which he's describing as anti-establishment and kind of radical and anti-war, and placing himself as the inheritor of that legacy in a way that's given him a lot of credibility with people who share that sort of anti-war sentiment. And that narrative, I think, works for him insofar it says, well, yeah, sure, he's a Kennedy. Sure, that it's Camelot, it's American royalty, it's incredibly elite and prestigious and insidery and deeply, you know, capital D democratic. However, because ultimately his own family members were perhaps targeted and killed by the FBI, the CIA, the deep state, whatever it is, then he's someone who can be trusted. I mean, what do you do with that narrative? How are you?
That's a very simplistic and mendacious narrative. Bobby Kennedy's obsession was the murder of Castro. That both JFK and RFK were, you know, bought all into the Cold War anti-communism stuff. So I read Evan Thomas's biography of RFK, and he had a kind of really telling line. He said the difference between Bobby and his brothers, Joe Kennedy, who was killed in World War II, he was a pilot, was being groomed. And you know, from day one, their father was orchestrating a political dynasty through his money. And so Joe and John and Robert was kind of forgotten, but he had a line in there that unlike Joe and John, Robert could actually feel that he was in touch with his emotions. So there is enough kind of circumstantial evidence to show that Bobby Kennedy cared about poor people. I mean, he would take time to go into poor urban areas, into rural Appalachia. He's touring South Commencement, and I think it was in Chile. He goes down and sees the conditions. I mean, he physically put himself in these places, which is I think, commendable. So he goes down into these mines and sees the conditions of the workers, and he comes out and he says, if I were them, I'd be a communist too. So, but it's always mixed, you know. So I don't want to trash. I have less time for the deification of John F. Kennedy, and everyone should read Seymour Hersh's book, The Dark Side of Camelot. I think there's a lot of mythology around JFK. Did the CIA hate him? Yes, that's real. And Dulles, in particular, who was insane, and the fact that he was the head of the Warren Commission, and because it was all on Cuba, because he wouldn't allow air cover to protect the Cuban exiles who invaded at the Bay of Pigs, which deeply angered the Cuban exiles and the anti-communists like Dulles, who had orchestrated the Bay of Pigs. And then the other was Bobby Kennedy's fierce investigations as attorney generals against the mafia. So they had potent and lethal enemies, and there was a bizarre connection between the CIA and the mafia because they hired, before the revolution, the mob kind of ran Havana. They had all the casinos and stuff. So they had a lot of contacts in Cuba. So the CIA at one point was hiring mobsters to take out hits of Castro. So you had the connection between the CIA and the mob, coupled with the fact that Bobby, as Attorney General, did mount a very concerted campaign to break the back of the mafia. That is real. I mean, Jimmy Hoffa hated Bobby Kennedy. So those forces, they're, people who I don't think you can discount it. there has always been this feeling that the fusion of those forces came together in JFK's assassination. We don't know. I mean, I read David Talbot's book, where the last kind of quarter of it is on the Kennedy assassination. I think there's a lot of compelling questions. I don't think anyone's ever found a smoking gun. I don't think we've ever proved it, but I don't discount it.
Well, RFK Jr. certainly seems to believe that's the case. I mean, he speaks at length about it, and it does seem to land some credibility in folks' eyes when he says he is interested in defunding the FBI or stripping these intelligence organizations of power, reining them in, et cetera. And I wonder, even if you don't agree with his understanding of his family's legacy or the historical narrative, if you believe that he's being authentic when he articulates those as policy goals of his, and if that's a legitimate reason why people should be excited for his campaign.
So the only reason I would say he's authentic is because I don't know him. I've never met. I was interviewed by him, but I don't have any spending time with him. I trust Dennis, and Dennis believes he's authentic, and Dennis is definitely authentic. So my best educated guess is that yes, he's authentic. He does not, however, have the long track record of standing with the marginalized and being an anti-imperialist the way Cornel does. And that's why, and Bernie had that. I mean, let's give Bernie that kind of credit. I mean, from day one, Bernie, what was it? They were trying to trash Bernie to the campaign that he hadn't done civil rights. And then somebody dragged out some picture of Bernie being arrested somewhere in Chicago or something.
Chained to a black woman, for housing, segregated housing, protesting segregated housing.
So I don't personally agree with Bernie's compromises, but I think Bernie has integrity the way Cornel does. And that goes, that's decades in the building, the way a figure like Jeremy Corbyn does. That's a concern of mine about Kennedy, that a lot of these seem to be apparently he was a good environmental rights lawyer, but a lot of these issues I don't see that he has a long track record with, and that always makes me suspect. I mean, Cornel has not deviated. I was in divinity school, and Cornel, who was, a few years old, was already a superstar. I mean, in his 20s, so we forget, So... and he took a lot of hits. I mean, he stood up to Obama.
Yeah.
The Obama White House really made life uncomfortable for him. So, yeah. I mean, Black Radio, he was called a race traitor, and they managed to get a lot of his speaking engagements canceled. And so he's been through it. I mean, he's been attacked.
However, and it's ongoing.
And it's going to get really bad because my best guess is that Bobby doesn't run beyond the primary. There's no way it's absolutely impossible for him to get the nomination. They'll figure it doesn't matter how much support he has. He's not going to get it.
Yeah, we've been on that rodeo train before.
Yeah, of course. And then because even if Cornell's polling in the single digits, that's a threat to Biden. So they're going to come down on Cornel.
As they've already started to say on the mainstream news, they've been circling the wagons. I want to play a clip for you. So Cornel West went on MSNBC, and in a different MSNBC segment, they were talking about his interview. Let's just play this clip, and I want to get your reaction.
We have progressive activist Robert Cornel West, who first announced running for president in the People's Party, but now he is switching to the Green Party. He's addressing accusations of potentially being a spoiler in the election. Take a listen.
You don't look to the weakest candidates as a full explanation as to why you lose. Sister Hillary Clinton lost because she was not a good candidate. The idea of putting all the responsibility on the candidates who get the fewest votes compared to the other big two is just a way of rationalizing a two-party system that has become more and more outdated and antiquated.
Do you agree with that? I mean, in today's national politics, how big an impact does a third-party candidate have to siphon votes from Democrats and Republicans? And is he going to be on the ballot in 50 states?
Well, you just touched on it and Elise touched on it. The key is ballot access, right? If the Green Party, if Cornel West is the nominee for the Green Party and the Green Party is on the ballot in an Arizona or a Wisconsin or a Pennsylvania, then the impact could be significant. I mean, I think what Cornel West is saying there, it doesn't appear to be all that versed in history, right? We don't have to go back far. The 2000 election, George Bush is declared the winner of Florida by 537 votes.
Right.
And yet 97,000 people voted for Ralph Nader. So it's a concern.
Yeah.
So Chris Hedges, is Cornel West insufficiently versed in history?
Yeah, well, I haven't met anybody better versed in history than Cornel West. I mean, that just is spitting back a lie, because they only counted 2 counties. Even Al Gore says now he won Florida. They stopped counting because they had an estimated 354,000, if I remember, votes that were invalidated, Democratic votes. And they pushed it to the Supreme Court, where George Bush was anointed president by judicial fiat. That's the truth. Had nothing to do with Nader. In fact, if I remember Ralph saying, I think the Libertarian Party got even more. I mean, this is just part of the demon. It's the distortion of history to demonize third-party candidates. And after 2000, the Democrats were terrified of Ralph. And it was awful what they did to him. And of course, you're right, they've already started with Cornel, but having anybody say that Cornel doesn't understand history there's not much that Cornel doesn't understand. I mean, having spent hours being humbled before his brilliance.
Well, the other part of that clip that really stood out to me was Robert Gibbs, former White House press secretary, that's the male voice that listeners can hear in that clip, saying, well, the key is really ballot access. And what I heard when I heard him saying that, it was almost like a bat signal that you're putting out into the world saying, make sure the Green Party doesn't have ballot access. That's the game plan. Yeah,
it is the game plan. If you read Teresa Amato's book, Grand Illusion, which everyone should read, The Myth of Voter Choice in a Two-Party Tyranny, she was Ralph's campaign manager and in-house counsel, both in 2000 and 2004. She wrote a book specifically about all of the obstacles and impediments they place to make sure both parties third parties cannot get on the ballot, because it goes back to Ross Perot, where I think he got 19%, and they were Andy was allowed to be in the debates, and that they said that's never happening again. So yeah, the key is ballot access. He's right about that. What he's not telling you is that the duopoly has gamed and rigged the system so effectively that it's extremely difficult for third parties even to get on the ballot, much less run. And the way they do it is it's expensive to get on the ballot. Not only do you have to hire, serious ballot access people who are attorneys to make sure your lists are legal and all that, but then it's expensive legally because they're always challenging you in court.
So the process is it mostly signature collection, and then the court disputes are over legitimacy of those signatures, or is there some other aspect to it?
I don't know. You're the lawyer.
Well, I'm not an election lawyer, unfortunately, but I'll have to find one.
School. I only know Karl Barth. I don't. My understanding is they challenge the lists, even if they're legal.
Right.
It racks up your legal fees.
Right.
Because they know you have such limited money.
Yeah.
It kills you.
The other part of this that always boggles my mind, and I raised this with Dr. West when he was on the podcast last week, is that there's an alternate universe where the Democratic Party is just open and fair, LOL, where they say, well, the ticket isn't ballot access. The issue isn't ballot access. The issue is the Democratic Party, if it was genuinely invested in preventing Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis or whomever from being president, as opposed to being genuinely invested in preserving its own power as one of 2 corporate parties, then it would be advocating aggressively for ranked choice voting or some alternative to first past the post voting, which puts it in this position. But of course, if they did that, they would give up their ability to pressure people via vote blue no matter who into compromising for any number of, frankly, compromised candidates like Joe Biden.
Well, we know exactly the Democratic Party hierarchy and donor class preferred Trump to Bernie. They were upfront about it. I mean, Lloyd Blankfein, there's someone who should be in prison. the former head of Goldman Sachs, came out, even alone, he said if Bernie's the nominee, we're all going to support Trump. We know the Democratic Party either supports the corporate indentured Biden, and if somehow there's a real insurgency and a figure who is not like Bernie, corporate indenture, then they'll go with the Trump. They'll go with the Republican corporate indenture. That's the real beating heart of the Democratic Party, and that's not even hidden.
Yeah, I mean, I want to ask you, since, I mean, you say here's someone should be in prison. I mean, it obviously jogs my thinking about what's happening right now with the most recent Trump indictment. Daniel Ellsberg of the Pentagon Papers just passed away. There's been a lot of conversation about the nature of confidential documents and the ways that the Espionage Act has been historically weaponized against not leakers, but leakers that reveal information that is inconvenient to the intelligence industry and that is very much of public interest, as opposed to the everyday course of leaks that are fed to mainstream newspapers who often happily just repeat those deep state talking points, if you will. And so I wonder if you've given much thought to how the left should be thinking about the use of the Espionage Act to get Trump, to quote Dershowitz.
Well, the Espionage Act has always been dirty, going all the way back to its inception in 1917. And it was used first against the left. They shut down the masses under the Espionage Act. They threw the socialist candidate Eugene V. Debs. I think he was actually officially charged under the Sedition Act. They deported Emma Goldman. So it's always been a weapon that has, in the name, sort of roughly the equivalent of the British Foreign Secrets Act. It's always been a weapon that's used to hit critics that the establishment doesn't like. I have my doubts as to how far they'll get with Trump. This has just been a cycle we have gone through since he was inaugurated. They haven't stopped, and maybe they will. Maybe they'll bring him down this time. I don't know. But it's been a reoccurrent theme. Yeah, the Espionage Act. As you know, I'm a friend and strong supporter of Julian Assange, who could very well be extradited this week, because the last appeal, his appeal, the Judge Baritza in January of 2019, I guess it was, can't remember, or no, it would have been 2022, I think. Anyway, I can't remember the year, but anyway, about a year ago, she blocked the extradition, not because she didn't find him guilty, but because he was a suicide risk and the inhumane conditions of the American prison system. The U.S. government issued a diplomatic note that gave all sorts of guarantees, none of which are worth the paper legally that they're written on. So they greenlighted the extradition. Assange's attorneys appealed. The appeal was rejected. They have one last kind of emergency appeal, and the reports are that they will rule this week. Now, if they reject that appeal, it's not inconceivable that he could be, given a sedative, put in diapers, hooded, and stuffed on one of those CIA planes and brought back this week. And that's all the Espionage Act against somebody who's not even an American citizen and who has a news organization that's not even based in the United States. So the Espionage Act has kind of like become Stalin. Stalin had this Law 58 that they used at the height of the purges just to be able to arrest you for anything. That's kind of what the Espionage Act has become. Are they going to get Trump? Again, having been a reporter for so long, it's hypothetical. It's a guess because I don't like making those guesses unless I've interviewed the people who are engaged in that, and I don't know, but I have my doubts.
Just because of the sheer number of attempts that there have been so far.
Yeah, and he's lawyered up, and he can drag it out. And if he drags, he could very well be running.
I guess my question is less, what do you think will come of the prosecution, but how you think the left should be advocating one way or another. So to your point, if it is the case that Julian Assange could be extradited this week, it puts the left in a very difficult position. If in the normal course of things, we should be advocating for the repeal of the Espionage Act. But in this particular political moment, to do so is even more likely to get us, again, accused of being indifferent to Trump and his crimes, sympathetic to Trump in some kind of horseshoe theory way. There is this argument that, sure, the Espionage Act is bad and has been historically weaponized against people who are trying to bring forward stories of the public interest and shine a light on the horrific actions of the American government. But for once, this time, it's going after somebody rich and powerful. And is justice letting him off the hook when others have gone down? I mean, have you given much thought to from a messaging perspective, the left should be on that?
Yeah, I would say there's one message to the left, and that is that the FBI is not your friend, despite the Mueller report and everything else. So, of course, the Espionage Act should be repealed. It's been used primarily against the left, primarily. And when we normalize those kinds of procedures, we slit our own throat because we're the primary victims. You know, they may have this case. It's all the anti-terrorism laws, the special administrative measures that were used against after 9/11 against Muslims. I'm very involved in it because I come out of the Middle East, and Muslims were demonized after 9/11. They may have been a car mechanic living in Dearborn, Michigan. It didn't matter. And of course, all these draconian legal procedures were pushed through. Well, now they can be used against anyone and are being used against animal rights activists, environmental activists, Cop City. Those people are being charged under these terrorism laws. So
absolutely,
you don't want to justify the breakdown of the rule of law, habeas corpus. You don't want to do that for anyone, even Trump. And Trump has many ways to protect himself in ways we don't. So yeah, I think that's how they sell you on this stuff. That's how they sold us the Patriot Act.
Yeah, Ken Klippenstein came on Rising this morning and talked about his most recent reporting for The Intercept about how there's been a tenfold increase in investigations by the FBI into pro-abortion advocates, activists, despite the fact that there's never been a documented instance of anybody being seriously hurt or killed by a pro-abortion activist, and there being, a couple dozen instances of anti-choice activists successfully killing people who support the right to choose, that there has, they have the cover, I think, because of the now liberal appetite for expanding the FBI's powers. They're using it to go after not who I think the liberals would hope that they would go after, but that's the nature of these institutions and institutional creep. I want to ask you a little bit about a conversation that started at that Workers' Strike Back Socialist Alternative event that we were at last week. At one point, Shama Sawant was talking about the benefits of a presidential campaign outside of the simple electoral yes or no vote on a ballot that one will fill out at the end of the whole thing. The benefits from an organizing perspective, the benefits of helping people to rally behind concrete messages and mature their political identity. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit more to what you hope to come out of Cornel West's campaign, besides obviously the hope that we all, would love to see him win. But short of that, what concrete gains do you think we should be looking to?
Well, there are a couple. First of all, it gives expression to those working men and women who are attempting to organize and regain power over their own lives. It gives a clear political expression to that, which isn't small. No presidential, no political candidacy, no political party is going to be worth anything unless we rebuild robust unions that frequently use the one weapon they have against the oligarchy, and that's the strike. And so that's one thing that's important. The other thing is that we're not going to build an alternative political movement in an election cycle. And this was Bernie's great failing. Bernie raised quite a bit of money for his political revolution, and then at the end herded people back into the embrace of the corporate Democrats. So you go back, it took Syriza 10 years to take power in Greece. And their first election, I think they polled 4%. And we have to think in the long term, as I know Cornel is. We're trying to build a real political movement, and that is going to require people to overcome the fear, and they are going to, because they don't, Biden's, both sides, they don't have anything to offer their constituents other than fear of the other. And it's effective. And because you're pounded with it, with the media, I mean, they've already started. But we're going to have to overcome that fear. And just on the issue of the climate crisis alone, we have no time left. And so we've got to stand up against these forces. And of course, it's very hard at the beginning because they seek to disempower you by telling you that it's not only useless, but it's counterproductive. And I think we have to take the long, I mean, look at the abolitionists on the eve of the Civil War. Everybody wrote them off as dreamers, utopians. And yet by 1865, slavery had been abolished. So, and we have the reversal of Reconstruction and Jim and Jane Crow and all that after. Don't want to say that anything was great after that, but it's always, the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr calls it, those possessed of sublime madness, in which he says that people possessed of that sublime madness that hold fast to a moral imperative or a vision in times of distress are far more effective than a bankrupt liberalism. And I think we're at that moment. And I think that that's a good way to describe Cornel and what he's doing. And I am a great admirer of Ralph because Ralph saw that. He understood that politics is a game of fear, that you pull, as Ralph said, he knew he wasn't going to win 5, 10, 15 million people into a third party. The Democratic Party starts to be afraid. And that's the only way it reacts. That's why Ralph says our last liberal president was Richard Nixon, not because Nixon was a liberal, but because we had powerful movements from the 1960s that frightened him. And we have to, without those popular movements, we have no power. But we, at the same time, need a political expression of those movements. And while there are many things that Bobby Kennedy says that I agree with, I know Cornel has spent his entire life standing for this and fighting.
I gotta say, it feels so good, honestly. I've been, me personally, hinting around the edges of it. I obviously have voted Green for the last 2 cycles. I have, I've written an article called Defensive Litmus Test that basically asked the question, challenging Noam Chomsky's take on this show back in the fall of 2020, that vote blue no matter who is just imperative given rising fascism, et cetera, that at a certain point, the ratchet effect is only going in one direction. And at some point, you have to have the moment where you're willing to lose. You're willing to make there be a real cost for the Democratic Party, because absent that, there's absolutely no leverage. There is absolutely no fear. And there's something that I will say feels so ideologically consistent and right about supporting someone in a general election without having to also do the second guessing of, will they do the dirty break? Won't they do a dirty break? Are they just going to sheep herd? There's something that feels powerful about not having to hide the extent to which, yes, you were willing to cause the Democratic Party to lose because there's a longer game being played here than just the every 4-year election cycle.
Well, watch how they pile on Cornel. And they pile on Cornel because they're frightened. Yeah. And they have every reason to be frightened. And it's our job to make sure not only they are frightened, but they're even more frightened. That's our job. That's what politics is about.
Well, let me ask you just quickly before we wrap, some news. The teachers union and the nurses union have both come out now in the last few days and endorsed Joe Biden. Bernie's campaign got an early boost of legitimacy from getting endorsements from, historically, left-leaning unions. The nurses union and the relationship to Medicare for All was very meaningful. The teachers union has been so radical of late with the wildcat strikes of 2018 or so. Are you concerned about this development? Does that feel like evidence of a retrenchment of some kind?
No, it's the bankruptcy of mainstream unions, which have become junior partners in the capitalist system. And so the effective strikes, so the old West Virginia teachers strike, for instance, was a wildcat strike that was carried out by the teachers in defiance of the union leadership. The union leadership is largely bankrupt. Biden just broke the rail workers' potential to strike. And As a candidate, he talked about strengthening collective bargaining, and then as soon as that strike was threatened, he took away collective bargaining from one of the very few entities of workers that possess it. I mean, so you got to look at what they do, not what they say. I mean, he says he's a pro-union president. I mean, this is garbage after NAFTA. I mean, Biden, I have a lot of anger towards Biden. I mean, you go back and look, I mean, the author of the Patriot Act, NAFTA, I teach in a prison, as you know, half of my students wouldn't be there but for Biden and Clinton. The amount of suffering, and then he was calling for an invasion of Iraq 5 years before we invaded. You have to look at the consequences, the suffering that was visited on hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands, millions of people, including in this country. And you can't walk away from that. You have to be held accountable for that. And these people, he may be a kind of, intellectually limited, people say he's a nice guy. I don't know whether he is. I don't care. The policies that he has embraced have diminished our democracy, got us into all sorts of foreign wars that we should have never been in, including the 20 years in the Middle East. I mean, in the end, both parties are utterly subservient to the war industry. That's it. I mean, they have all these cuts. They won't touch this Pentagon budget, which is 10 times with the next. It's more than 10 times of the next 10 countries combined, including Russia and China. So, yeah, I mean, they're very good. This public relations industry is very good at creating fictional personas that we come to believe in the same way that we believe that Trump was a great businessman because of The Apprentice. But we have to look at what they do. And Biden's policies, well, that's why Barack Obama chose him. He was a Democrat who always voted Republican. They used to call him Senator Credit Card because he worked for the credit card
Senator from
industry
MBNA.
Based in Delaware.
Right.
And that's why the Democratic Party anointed him, because he was a company guy.
I mean, coming back to this point of the union leadership, I didn't want to press too hard on this at the Workers' Strike Back event. I didn't want to be too negative. It is an event that's, initiating an effort to do grassroots organizing of the type that I very much think is necessary. We had two representatives of unions on the panel with us, someone from the Writers Guild and someone from a grad student union. However, when we see what's happened with the teachers union and the nurses union, and there is this critique of business unionism and the captured nature of union leadership. And then simultaneously, there's this discussion of how the path forward for the left is through unions and workers, as opposed to through electoral politics. It can start to feel quite demoralizing when you're basically realizing that the group collectively that held the most promise and existing organization seems to have been neutered so effectively and feel so confident in thumbing their nose at the movements they were recently aligned with in Bernie Sanders. And at this juncture, when there's only one candidate in the race in the Democratic primary who's advocating for Medicare for all, and it certainly isn't Joe Biden, it certainly isn't RFK Jr., that there isn't just a willingness to sit it out, but an eagerness, it feels like, to go ahead and endorse the guy that has been basically giving you the finger for years. I mean, what do you say to people who might find that to be a kind of demoralizing portrait of a path forward?
That is a comment on the bankruptcy of the leadership, not the membership.
Right.
Because the leadership is selling out the membership.
So how does one get around that?
You've got to get rid of the leadership. That's what Kshama Sawant's trying to do. Workers' Strike Back is about building militant union movements where the leaders are not allied with the ruling class. That's what her whole movement is about. And she's right. That's what has to be done.
Yeah.
I mean, these people are part of the problem. AFL-CIO, all these people.
Yeah.
And as things get worse and worse, as we, create this whole gig economy is just a species of serfdom, really. And it's not going to get better. This leadership, and remember the salaries these people are pulling down. $250,000 or something. I forget which union it was. So they've been integrated into the oligarchic elite in essence, and And so when we talk about rebuilding union strength, we're talking about replacing these traditional unionists, union leaders, who make these decisions, such as the one you just mentioned about endorsing Biden.
Yeah. Well, I strongly recommend people go and listen to the entirety of that Worker Strike Back event, not just the parts that salaciously got clipped for the internet because you were making big news. Chris Hedges, thank you so much for spending the hour with me once again. Can you tell the listeners where they can find you and your work on the internet and beyond?
ChrisHedges.substack.com. ChrisHedges.substack.com. It all goes out there.
All right,
There's
terrific.
a show on the Real News every Friday, too. So, yeah.
Awesome. I'm sure I echo the sentiments of many listeners when I say that we're very glad that you have such a close relationship with Cornel West, and we just are so thankful for your guidance. I'm sure Dr. West is also thankful for your guidance and your friendship, and it's hard to imagine a better team as we move forward.
I admire him tremendously. You know, he's the real thing, and you know, his commitment to the marginalized is, I've seen it over and over and over. I brought him into the prison where I teach. All the students asked him to come teach. This guy has a schedule that would kill most mortals. And he came in and taught a philosophy class there. There was no cameras, nobody paid him, nobody, you know, he's real. And that's why I'm so fiercely loyal to him and supportive of his candidacy.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you to all of the listeners for tuning in once again. If you would like another episode of Bad Faith every week, you know you can subscribe at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast and get our Monday premium episodes. As always, take care of yourselves and keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.